Hi everyone. In today's podcast we discuss Japan's regional security cooperation. We look at its domestic arm industry, also at its relationship with Taiwan, and the conflict about the Senkakus. Welcome to the show.
This is characteristic of an assertive China under Xi Jinping that is determined to uh, erode away the American-led security architecture in the region. There is a very limited window where China can make and lock in significant gains in its regional environment so that it has a more favorable future.
Hi everyone. Today we have a Canadian scholar, Stephen Nagy. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Good morning.
Good morning. Okay, so please tell us a little bit about yourself and then we would talk a little bit about Japan and its neighbors, okay?
Sure, Richard. I'm of Canadian extraction, but I've lived and worked in Japan and Hong Kong and traveled throughout this region for about 25 years straight now. I did my PhD at Waseda University in international relations. And my research focus today is looking at Sino-Japanese relations, middle power cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, and broadly looking at how Japan is engaging with regional partners, whether it's Southeast Asian countries, Korea, of course, China, as well as the United States.
Great, thank you. So that's what I wanted also to start with, Japan's regional alliances and its expanding security cooperation with neighbors. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, what's going on and what's the direction Japan is going.
Sure. Japan only has one alliance, and that's with the United States. It's a comprehensive partnership that has deepened decade by decade. But what Japan has done over the past 20 years is develop something called strategic partnerships. And strategic partnerships are a kind of cooperative mechanism that Japan uses to build shared objectives, shared norms, and interoperability capabilities with regional partners. So we see this with the provision of Coast Guard vessels to countries like Vietnam. We see this in terms of joint training in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. We also see it in terms of research, search and rescue operations. So from Japan's point of view, achieving security means building strong partnerships that are not solely about hard or traditional security, but helping enhance the capabilities of those countries through trade, through infrastructure connectivity, so that they are more strategically autonomous and better placed partners to cooperate with Japan on not only the security front, but also the diplomatic front and economic front.
How is this then related to Japan's domestic arms industry? I think it's not first grade and there is not much international sales going on. I think the government is trying to somehow improve it.
What we see in terms of Japanese arms sales abroad is that Japan has several conditions in terms of selling um, arms to other countries. One is they can't be involved in a civil war. Two, they can't be involved in a conflict with a neighboring state, and a few other legal requirements to allow for Japan to sell countries weapons to countries. So these legal conditions are really in line with Japan's pacifist constitution. It's Article 9, which is this idea that Japan has given up the right to use force as an instrument of foreign policy. But beginning back in 2008, I believe, under the or 2010 or 11, I believe, under the Noda administration, is that there was a loosening of the legal requirements to allow for Japan to export arms. And since that time, we've seen an incremental increase in Japanese arms exports, but nothing substantial compared to, for example, the United States, Russia, China, and other countries. And I think that at this stage, that's probably going to be the trajectory over the short to midterm until Japan makes some legal changes domestically to allow for more flexibility of where it can, who it can sell weapons to.
So how is the domestic discussion with regard to that? Is Japan ready? I know the politicians, especially the prime minister, are pushing for some changes, increase in spending. But how does the society view it? Do they see the threat from China really looming over the country, or are they not so aware and they have other problems?
So, in terms of defense spending, Japan has committed to reaching 2% of GDP in terms of
Yes.
uh, acquiring uh, uh, securing a budget to build this defense capacity. Now, this could mean many, many things. It could mean enhancing their maritime domain awareness activities, their over the horizon radar activities, their satellite technologies, their cybersecurity activities, and skill sets. And these are actually outlined in the Ministry of Defense's white papers on what they would like to acquire through increases in Japan's defense budget. And the reason is simple, is that they want to have total domain awareness to deal with the increasing number of missile tests from North Korea so that they can monitor not only the quantity but also quality of missiles that are being launched into the Sea of Japan and over Japan, have a very good understanding of where North Korea is building and creating its nuclear weapons facilities so that they can prevent proliferation. China is another important domain that Japan is thinking about very deeply. China primarily concentrates most of its security assets, its offensive capabilities along the east coast of China, in particular across the Taiwan Strait. And Japan would like to get a very good understanding of how these assets are being deployed and how they could potentially be used in some kind of conflict with Japan over the Senkaku Islands, or God forbid, if there was a conflict with Taiwan, how would Japan be able to defend um, working with the United States bases on Okinawa and throughout the Japanese archipelago? So these are kind of the ways Japan is thinking about increasing its defense budget. Most recently, they're talking about the acquisition of preemptive strike capabilities. And these are primarily targeted at Pyongyang, with the understanding that it's increasingly difficult to say with 100% certainty that Japan will be able to defend against uh, a mass attack by North Korea. And the thinking here is that, well, preemptive strike capabilities may be a better deterrent against North Korean missile systems. These are not, I think, at this stage, being secured for a conflict with China. Other aspects of the defense acquisition that you may be interested in is looking at how the budget will be put together. And at this stage, we don't see a qualitative change in the procurement process of weapon systems for Japan yet. What we do see, though, is to reach that 2%, is that the government is likely going to um, combine various budgets so it does reach 2%. So, for example, combining the Coast Guard budget, that would be able to increase the total amount of GDP or percentage of GDP that would be designated to the 2% increase. We also see housing, salaries, acquisitions of bullets also being placed in these budgets. So I think we still have to wait where the 2% will go, and will there be a qualitative change in the procurement process of Japan in terms of defense capabilities, and where those defense capabilities will be stationed. And in this case, I think that we're going to see more burden sharing between the United States and partners in Japan, where Japan provides the comprehensive domain awareness and provides this intelligence to its partners like the United States to be able to push back against aggressive behavior of states in the region.
I also asked this because recently Japan hosted the International Fleet Review in November, and when the U.S. Aircraft carrier Ronald Reagan was accidentally, as they put it, passing by, the prime minister flew there in a helicopter, and this was kind of downplayed by the government that the aircraft carrier was just there, that it wasn't really kind of participating in the fleet review. Why did the government play it down? Why didn't they really just admit that the carrier was there and kind of participated in the international fleet review?
Well, I think the International Fleet Review in itself was meant to normalize Japan's behavior as a state that works with other countries in terms of maritime security. And what we've seen of Japan over the past 10 or 15 years is to continually to try to normalize that process. And I think by and large, Western countries, I would say Southeast Asian countries, Australia, Canada, they all think Japan as a normal state, not a military state, not militarizing, and with no ambition to attack neighboring states. But for former colonies of Japan, in particular the Korean Peninsula, and of course China with the Sino-Japanese War, they have very different interpretations of Japan. So Japan is always sensitive to these two countries' interpretations of how Japan and its leaders are engaging with the United States. And for, I think, Prime Minister Kishida, flying to the Reagan aircraft carrier, an instrument of war that can project power and massive power in the region, really isn't the optics that I think the Japanese government would like to convey to the Koreas or China. But at the same time, I think that they also want to demonstrate that Japan is fully committed to the U.S. Alliance, that it is fully committed to deterring aggression within the region and changing the region's security architecture by force. So it's a delicate message, and I think that the Japanese governments are going to continue to try and balance this post World War II pacifist identity with the realities of neighborhood that are increasingly severe, whether it's Russia in the northern territories, North Korea with weapons proliferation and missile testing within the Sea of Japan and over Japan, or China's attempts to really revise the regional security architecture. Japan has lots to lose, and it has really an incentive to work with the United States and other like-minded countries to preserve the rules-based order within the region.
I have still a question or two with regard to Taiwan. I think considering how close Japan and Taiwan are, I think it would be obvious for Taiwan and Japan to cooperate more in terms of security. And also there were the plans to station a missile base on the Ishigaki Island, and also to expand Japan's military forces on Okinawa and its associated islands to the southwest approaching Taiwan. How is this considered in Japan? The kind of a closer cooperation and banding together with Taiwan in terms of
Well, I think we
security?
can look at this at three levels. Let's start with the lowest level,
Yes.
the ordinary Japanese, the citizens. Japanese citizens have a huge amount of affection, nostalgia, and shared values with Taiwan. They look at Taiwan very favorably. Uh, just over the past 50 years, I believe there's about $70 billion of trade or FDI between the two countries. When Japan had the big earthquake back in
Yes. Yes.
2011, the biggest donor was Taiwan, right?
Hmm.
So the Japanese remember this, and similarly, when Taiwan has had earthquakes, the Japanese are there. They reciprocate, not because of duty, but because of real affection. So I think for the ordinary Japanese, they look at Taiwan's increasingly severe relationship with China, and they do have concerns because of this sincere relationship at the grassroots level. But that being said, I don't know if they're there in terms of defending Taiwan through some kind of military engagement. This is not where the discussion is at the grassroots level. In terms of the business community, which is really important, they as well are really hesitant to talk about defense and talk about bolstering relations with Taiwan outside the normal business sphere. And this is because they are concerned about how it would impact their footprint within China. And here, Japan's corporate Japan is in a very similar situation to U.S. corporations, as Isaac Stone Fish wrote in his book America Second, where in many ways the corporations are captured by their investments in China, and they understand that they will lose access if they take positions on Taiwan or positions that the Chinese government deems not in their interests. That being said, they want to continue to engage with Taiwan and build as much economic engagement with Taiwan as possible. The policymakers, on the other hand, look at Taiwan and they look at it through sea lines of communication, and they look at it through supply chains, in particular semiconductors. Um, in this region, about 5.5 trillion US dollars of trade goes through the Malacca Strait, South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, East China Sea. This is a huge amount. This is annually. And as a result, Japan has lots to lose. If any of these sea lanes are disrupted through a kinetic conflict or blockade, this is an existential threat to the Japanese economy. So policymakers are thinking about how they can cooperate with Taiwan, bolster its defense and deterrence capabilities, while maintaining the one China policy that is the basis for normalization between China and Japan. They also look at it through supply chains, and in particular semiconductors. You're based in Taiwan, you understand this, but many of Japan's signature industries, whether it's Toyota, Honda, Sony, Sony PlayStations, those great games that we all like, um, they all use the semiconductors that are produced by the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company. So a disruption in those supply chains would have a heavy toll on the signature industries of Japan. And again, this is why I think when Japan is thinking about military cooperation with Taiwan, it's thinking about deterrence, but it's also thinking about resilience. And that resilience side is um, uh, courting the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company to build some chips in Japan, to help support building it in Arizona, to build a new safe manufacturing partners so that they can avoid the bottlenecks associated with a potential weaponization of technology supply chains from China. So that cooperation that you're talking about, it can't just be about security cooperation. It has to have a resilient side. It has to have a trade side to really create security from the Japanese standpoint, but also contribute to Taiwan's security and continued peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait.
I still have two questions with regard to Japan and China, actually, and Taiwan, because recently, after Nancy Pelosi's visit, uh, China kind of blocked or blockaded Taiwan and also shot few missiles into kind of Japanese area. So there are articles that claim that it was that she adopted the plan covering Japan's exclusive economic zone to warn the Kishida administration against strengthening Tokyo's involvement in the Taiwan Strait. And so how can Japan respond to that? And also considering their meetings with the Chinese with regards to the Senkakus, the meetings are actually pointless and lead to nowhere. What can actually Japan do to cope with the problem, also in terms of Taiwan and also their own problems with the Senkakus? How can they deal with China?
Well, Richard, I think this is a complicated question, and nobody really knows what's in the black box of Zhong Enlai or Xi Jinping's mind, and whether he really made this decision to send a message to the Japanese by launching missiles into Japan's exclusive economic zones. But I think that the message that was understood by the Japanese was that um, this is characteristic of an assertive China under Xi Jinping that is determined to uh, erode away the American led security architecture in the region. They understood the commitment that China has to reunifying with Taiwan, either by force or through attrition, through economic coercion, gray zone tactics, and other pressure on Taiwan. And I think they understood that China has the capabilities to attack Japanese territories. That being said, I think that the Japanese still are in a position where China is dependent on the technology transfers that come from Japanese investments within the region. We should always be mindful that it's Japanese corporations that hire hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Chinese workers in the provinces of China, and that local leaders have very different views about Japan's investments in their backyard. And they understand that as the central government continues to tighten transfers from the central government to the local government, that those local governments need to build strong partners with countries like Japan. So Japan continues to invest in those regional partnerships to build a kind of insurance policy. We should also understand that Japan produces many very niche products that are critical to the Chinese production network, and a conflict with Japan could also create supply chain challenges in which those businesses could not provide those technologies back to China, which would create problems in terms of their ability to keep their economy going. We saw a commercial or a bit of a commercial uh, about this after the 3/11 earthquake, in that many of the businesses that produce those niche products I mentioned and niche parts that go into the Chinese manufacturing Goliath were no longer able to be transported to China because of the infrastructure damages after the earthquake and tsunami. And this slowed down production and it created unemployment. So I think we really need to look at this relationship not in terms of it's asymmetric, but there's asymmetry on both sides that gives Japan and China advantages in different areas. Now this leads to the point about how should Japan deal with China on the Senkakus and Taiwan, and it continues to be a process of engagement where they engage through trade, regional comprehensive economic partnership, talk about a trilateral FTA with South Korea and Japan and China, potentially China coming into the TPP 11. So that's the engagement side. They're still open to environmental cooperation. We see Japan focus on resilience and economic security, which are key words in how Japan is talking about foreign policy. Resilience is terms of selective diversification away from the Chinese centered production network. That doesn't mean decoupling. It means selective diversification in particular areas that are sensitive, such as technology, building alternative production networks in Southeast Asia and South Asia, India, closer to centers of production, helping build infrastructure in those and connectivity in those countries so that they can be alternative hubs. The resilience also comes in terms of changing how Japan's economically engaging with China. The model now is build in China, by Chinese for Chinese with Japanese technologies. And we see Japan's global exporting footprint now build in Southeast Asia for global export. So this creates a bit of an insulation against some of the geopolitical challenges that exist between the two states. And then lastly is deterrence. And deterrence is largely through strengthening the US-Japan alliance, but also through new partnerships such as the reciprocal access agreement between Australia, the UK. We're likely to see other European countries create a reciprocal access agreement with Japan. You've seen the Germans here, the French, the Canadians, the Dutch, bringing their ships through the region, but also through the Taiwan Straits, which is trying to send a strong signal that these are international waters and that Japan and other like-minded countries are going to continue to behave according to the rules-based structure that has been laid out in the post-World War II period. So I think deterrence, engagement, resilience are kind of the key terms that I would use to answer your question with those examples.
Thank you very much. My last question is a bit of a speculation because we mentioned Xi Jinping. Where do you think does his belligerence come from? Does he want to make history, or does what is it that why is he so aggressive and so combative against Taiwan and Japan and all his neighbors?
Well, this is a really interesting question, and I think that some scholars or some analysts would say that it's out of a position of weakness. Others would say it's out of a position of strength. On my last visit to China, I think many Chinese scholars themselves suggested that there is a very limited window where China can make and lock in significant gains in its regional environment so that it has a more favorable future, and that this window is closing rapidly. And after that, the structural pressures on the economy associated with demographic change, associated with selective diversification away from China, and as we've seen with the United States and the CHIPS Act, there's going to be more pressure on technological evolution in China. And these will all have really downward pressures on the Chinese economy. And for these analysts, they strongly argue that these are Chinese analysts that really China needs to do as much as possible in the next 5 to 10 years, because after that, the peripheral environment around China will be very unfavorable. I lean towards this argument, and I think that it makes sense empirically if we look at, again, demographic trends, the quality of economic growth in China. What I mean by that in the service sector, are we creating high-paid jobs or low-paid jobs? The trends are not all quite negative. And the COVID-19 pandemic has made this worse, and the geopolitical competition between the United States and China is making it even worse. So in a sense, Xi Jinping's, I guess, more assertive behavior is based on really a dark assessment of where China is going, and the need to lock in as many gains as possible to create some stability in its periphery. Whether this will work or not, I think it's been a disaster. Compared to when 10 years ago, China's reputation is in a worse place. It has done the unthinkable. The South Koreans think worse of China than the Japanese. It's strengthened NATO. All the countries within the region are worried about what Chinese hegemony means. And it's focused the lens of the United States. And perhaps this is the real sleeping dragon that Napoleon was talking about, in that once you awaken the American dragon or American eagle, its comprehensive capabilities, from diplomatic partners to its economy, its innovation, its military prowess, is now all focused on China. And its flexibility suggests that it will be able to compete very effectively with a Chinese government that is going to face significant downward pressures on the economy moving forward.
Great. Thank you very much, Stephen, for your time in the morning hour and all the extensive explanations. I appreciate your time very much.
Thanks, Richard. It's great to talk to you, and I look forward to meeting you in person in Taiwan on my next visit.
Wow, hope so.
Thank you for watching the show. Please like it. Please leave a comment. Who should I talk to next? If you didn't like it, share it.